Hey team, what's up? Welcome back to another installment. EPL, Ethos, Pathos, Eternal Logos. I'm still working on the intro, so don't judge me. Uh, when we know, we'll know. We'll kind of get there and it'll kind of feel right. It'll roll off the tongue and it'll be set. But until then, we're going to keep working on it. Thank you guys for tuning in as always. Thank you for being a part. I appreciate each one of you. If you found this via thumbnail, if you've been searching YouTube, if I sent you a link, if you know someone to sent you a link, thank you so much. Thank them for sending you and recommending the podcast if it was a recommendation. Again, the podcast is really dedicated to helping people explore the realm of, the mind, thinking about thinking, going a little bit deeper in thought, and using our ability to be able to kind of comprehend and understand these ideas and take it just a step further, get people used to knowing what that looks like, becoming more aware of where their position is, if they're able to hold that position solidly on good foundation based upon where they come from, their culture, their belief system, and what they value. And seeing if you can draw a straight line from what you believe to the conclusions that you draw and which influence the decisions that you make on a daily basis, be it in a day-to-day conversation with your friends or your family, or be it any political view that you hold, any of the hot topic items, any of the taboo items or topics that people tend to shy away from. But I think the beginning of starting to open up that discussion means to first understand your position. And to understand your position is to first understand how human beings operate and think. And I think that is extremely important. It's absolutely foundational. And I personally think it should be taught in schools. I've had that conversation with a number of, well, maybe not necessarily a number of people or too many, but I certainly have had that conversation with my friend who is a teacher. Her name's Katie. Shout out to you, Katie. But we've had that discussion and we go back and forth on it. But I think understanding philosophy, reasoning, logic, and the thought flow helps people to understand and train their minds in terms of how to think critically about everything, not just, school or their work or their job, but also the positions they hold, like I mentioned before. So if you haven't seen the other podcast, this podcast will be in relationship a little bit to the first podcast that we did, which is What is Truth? If you can't find it, you should be able to find it through, if you click my name and explore my channel, you should be able to find that post. But today's video is going to be truth and belief, right? What are they? This particular podcast will be a little bit tailored towards the belief side and how we reconcile truth in belief or vice versa when they come into conflict. And we're just going to explore the idea a bit. I think it's starting to take shape a bit. I was having a conversation with a few of my friends this week, a decent number of conversations, and primarily because I'm starting to post, I think on my social media, I think it was Instagram, I posted up a story of, some of the new equipment that I have and posted a story of, me doing a recording, and people are reaching out to me and asking me the next logical question. What are you hoping to achieve? What are you doing in these podcasts? Is it a podcast? What's it going to be? In the first post in the What is Truth video, I do a lot of I'm not sure what we're going to call this. It's going to be just a platform. It's going to be a podcast. What's it going to be? But having some of those conversations when our friends brought up to me, talked about, he had tried to do some podcast stuff before, and it was, in his exploration, especially when it's an audio podcast, you kind of want to have a niche. You kind of have a particular topic or something that is pretty consistent across your entire catalog as you continue to build your content. And that resonated with me. And I thank him for it, for helping me recognize that as something that I'm going to need to make sure I concentrate on. These first few podcasts may be a little bit up and down, but it's hoping to establish some ground. So when we start to do more podcasts in the future, I can refer back to these and say, hey, kind of check out a few of the first podcasts that we had that will start to establish some of the ideas of what we're going to be trying to do. And I think today's topic is a really, really important one, and one that I want to make sure everybody at least starts to think about. Let's say that. What is truth? We started with that. Being able to correctly define truth as being something that is in reality, right? I think one of the definitions that you can use, and this is not an official Webster definition, but that which corresponds with reality, right? And we can explore reality a number of different ways. I think one of the more popular in the 21st century is exploring truth through the scientific method, right? And it's been pretty reliable as far as we can tell. But it does have its limits, right? There are other disciplines that aren't scientific in nature. History is one of them. Can we trust history? Why do we trust history? And I didn't say this in the last podcast, but again, fluidly building and, hopefully with some engagement with some of the comments that are potentially starting to come in from watching some of these podcasts. Hopefully you guys are catching some of this and putting it in the comments, and maybe some of them I'm catching. But me thinking about it now, in reference to building a good solid foundation and definition for what is truth, using examples and analogies, talking about the disciplines, the difference between science and history, for instance, the differences between science and math, right? We did talk about that in the last podcast, but these are all examples that can kind of get us an idea and be able to define truth. And then we can also rely on Webster. How does Webster define it? Just from in sort of a layman's sort of way, if we talk about truth, the definition is this. But I think a good philosophical definition is kind of that which corresponds with reality, but also knowing that our reality is based on our perception. And that's when you get into super heavy philosophy. Something that I'm trying to do in these podcasts is I have a natural affinity to want to gravitate towards more philosophical ideas and kind of talk about them and analyze them and really get into them. But I'm going to try to do it in a much simpler way and try not to talk too philosophically. In some ways, I'll start to bring in some philosophical terms to help get people familiar with what those philosophical terms mean. If you're listening to other podcasts or other content and they don't necessarily always explain the term or how they're using them, I'll try to make sure I do that in the podcast and at least define how I'm using it and how I understand it. And if I'm wrong, I'll go back and do a correction and say, okay, well, I misspoke here. This is the actual definition for that particular term. But again, all these podcasts are always free floating. I'm going to do my best to not edit them, but let's get down to the content. So we have truth and then we have belief. How do they mesh? When don't they mesh? When do they seem to contradict? I think there's a naive way of viewing belief. I think when people hear belief, they think of the religious kind. But belief is, and I'm more than willing, as always, to be challenged on any of these ideas that I say, but belief is primary. I think it's very important. That's going to sound weird, probably to some of you, but belief is primary. And if we think about knowledge, right? Belief is primary, and knowledge is a subcategory or a subsection, or knowledge depends on a belief system, right? We as human beings have belief before we can accept anything that knowledge that we gain through exploration, that we gain in that we call knowledge, essentially, right? I believe it was Einstein that said the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. That is to say, how can our minds in here comprehend the universe out there, right? That's thinking about thinking. That's a really good question to ask. And I think it's something that we can take for granted because we just accept it. When we're born, we start exploring the world and then we act in the world according to that, how we explore it. I understand that rocks are hard. If I fall on them, I might scrape my knee. That'll hurt, etc. You kind of move on and you kind of learn it. So it's a bit of trial and error, obviously. But to understand the mind and how the mind works sociologically, psychologically, that is via influence, and how human beings tend to operate based on our faculties that we're born with, that are passed down through, however long, through our parents, etc. And when we talk about belief, we're trying to understand that my mind is biased to my experiences oftentimes. That's when truth can contradict, in some cases, belief. If I have a particular belief about something, does the truth that somebody might tell me, evidence might come in and it might reject the truth as a result? There actually were studies done that said when people have a belief about something, if you give them evidence that might contradict their belief, people actually become more convinced or more convicted in the belief that they have. It's like a rebelling of the truth, which is really funny. But I think everybody was shocked to find these results, right? So the question is how do we get away from doing that to some degree? And we all do it in our lives. It's really, really hard to catch yourself. But I think thinking through these ideas, realizing, okay, this is my conclusion. Does the thing that I believe actually yield that conclusion if you follow a logical process, right? Super important. And like I say it again, I think it's something that can be very easily taken for granted. And so we're going to be exploring that obviously throughout the podcast. That's going to sort of be the thesis that I rest on, right? In addition to my particular belief systems and how I come to these conclusions based on these belief systems, and why sometimes I think people are wrong for believing particular things. Not to say that I think you're a bad person for it. I'm more than willing to be called out for being wrong as well. And that's what I want this podcast to help to do. It's okay, right? I know we tend to shy away from hearing the word, oh, you're wrong. And then people, get antsy about that. But it's not sometimes before you can be right, sometimes you have to be called out for being wrong. But the idea is to try to get back at the truth. If I'm wrong, okay, well, how can I get back to that which is more right or more true? And where am I going wrong? And being able to understand and explore your worldview and how that relates to it is very, very important to getting to that realization and taking yourself through that process to get yourself to be more true. And I think that is extremely important. Again, I've said that like 8 times already, but I really, really think that it's something that we can start to hope to make easier for people who are tuning into the channel, who are listening to some of the things that we're saying as we think through the ideas, and then hopefully it will start to become a little bit more obvious and a little easier, because I believe, just like many things, it's sort of a muscle. The more you exercise the muscle, the more you'll learn how to do it, right? Because it's something that I think you have to train just like anything else. And the more you do, the better you get at it. So truth and belief. I think in our 21st century in 2021, I think there is a lot of different ideas going around about truth. There are some people out there who don't believe that we can know objective truth. There are people out there who think that, subjective truth is all there is as a result of not being able to know objective truth. I won't particularly go down the road too far there, but it's sort of a postmodern view. If you know what postmodernism is, it's sort of this idea or this thought process to believe that everybody's truth is just as valid, right? That, it's all subjective. And like I said, the objective truth, if it even exists, is unknowable, right? I think one of the examples that I oftentimes hear about this is if I'm a postmodernist, and this is kind of getting at the heart of it as well, is to say that, well, in theory, right, that's kind of theoretical, right? So if I'm postmodern, I believe that there's only subjective truth. It's like, okay, well, in analogy, if I go to a bank tomorrow and I say, hello, Mr. Teller, Miss Teller, I would like to withdraw $100,000 from my bank account. And they go, okay, welcome, Mr. Brown. They do a little type up. oh, I'm sorry, it looks like you only have $50 in your account. And I look at them and say, well, that's your truth. My truth is I have $100,000, right? Well, what do we do? Now that's it. Theoretically, it sounds great, but it's impractical. And if someone was postmodern, and this is why I am not a postmodernist, would love to debate one. If someone out there is or think that they have a better explanation, thinking through these, maybe my analogy is wrong, maybe it doesn't quite follow up, but I'm interested. So if theoretically postmodernism sounds great, but when you try to make it practical, people tend to not live that way. And those who try to live that way find themselves in trouble with the law, with other people, constantly in conflict, because there seems to be something about that philosophy that doesn't hold from theory, from base foundation, I believe this philosophically worldview, to practice. And so it's met with objections. There's actually a pretty good quote that I've heard from one of my favorite apologists, John Lennox. He said, he's quoting somebody and he says, this person says, people are only postmodern on topics that they count as unimportant, right? Because the topics that you count as important, or the things that you have a great deal of passion about, you tend to defend them as if they're objectively true, right? So that's the truth side. And it's it's such an interesting, wide topic, and it's something we will definitely return to. Belief is sort of mysterious in nature, I think. I think we can reconcile it a bit in biology. We can say there's evolutionary reasons for people to hold the beliefs that they do. But, there are things that we develop as we move from childhood to adulthood that we start to take on and that we accept to be true and that we accept as beliefs that may not necessarily line up with the truth of reality, but it might be true for us in a subjective sort of position. So our belief systems seem to be an innate faculty, that they're primary, like I said before, and to gather knowledge, right, is to hopefully sharpen those beliefs, to make them stronger, to sort of continue to build steel into them, or to move away from that which we believe that may not be true. But there is a danger, because there are certain things in our world, in existence, that we kind of sort of work through every day, or we contend with, that can't necessarily be explored in sort of a scientific way, when you think about the natural sciences, right? And so those are some of the ideas that tend to come about in our hot topic items, right? Take any hot topic that we're exploring today, or that's a major point of discussion in our world, right? And you think about, well, how do people reach those conclusions? Now, they could be based on religious beliefs. They could be based on where you grew up, in the culture that you grew up in, and you can hold them to be true because you grew up in them and you think that's the best way. But there's an interesting way that we can explore our beliefs based on those worldview principles, and seeing if within the worldview itself, does our worldview hold the thing that we believe to be right? Like, if you're let's say a believer in a particular religion, and you hold a particular belief, it makes sense that somebody might say, okay, you believe in this particular religion. Well, let's see what the religious text says. Let's see what what the foundations of that religion are about. And then we can actually check that against the belief. Now, sometimes you might, even like I'll talk to other Christians, and they'll have a conclusion about something. They hold that thing to be true, but then it's like, okay, well, let's explore the Bible. Are you right or am I right? And I mean, that's where a lot of the biblical debates with amongst Christians that may happen, if old earth, new earth, those kinds of things. And we go back to the text and we say, okay, you believe that, but here is within the text itself where there may be contradiction, in hopes of saying like, okay, well, maybe you should adjust your belief. And that's ultimately what you hope, is that people are rational in the sense that we can always go down and dig further down to a person's worldview and the biasness that they hold that ultimately influences that which they believe, which then ultimately helps to shape and refine the values that they have in that worldview, which ultimately leads to certain conclusions that they have that we experience, others experience in the world, how people, what side do people fall on in the political realm, etc. Right. And so I think it's just a beautiful idea to bring about on the podcast, because I think there is an immense amount of beauty in this ability for human beings to be able to contend with these sort of ideas and really explore them, right? Because I am a Christian, I do believe that that we have that there's a supernatural agency that brings all these things into being. And so ultimately we're able to do this because we're created with the capacity to be able to do it. And I think that's a beautiful thing, but we have to obviously put it in its proper context, and we have to continue to explore if there is a supernatural component to all of this. What's the nature of that supernatural component, which obviously gets into a religious discussion. But just from my perspective, that's kind of where I start. Right. And so can I justify my conclusions based off of that? Right. And how are my beliefs shaped as a result? And does the truth line up with that? And sometimes you can think about it in either direction. Sometimes, like we were saying before, does your belief line up with what you say you believe in? And after, you've established some ground, you thinking that you have solid ground in what you believe in based off of your worldview, can you reconcile that in a practical sense when we talk about or explore ideas that might be opposed to one another, etc. And so it's just something that I thought would be a good, interesting topic to bring forward to everybody and see how everybody, what people are out there thinking about it, and just do a bit of a, sort of a open-ended sort of idea from my mind in video to get you guys a sense for kind of how I start to think about it. And so eventually, maybe we can get some experts to comment on, from a psychological perspective, from a sociological perspective. Maybe we can get some evolutionists who might have some evolutionary theories about how this might have developed in human beings. Again, like I said, I come from the worldview that I do believe that there is a supernatural component. And so, but I do accept certain theories about, through evolution and development and all of those kinds of things. And it might be a question that some people have for me. How do you reconcile? I actually had this conversation with a friend. How do you reconcile your belief system with science? Some people put them at odds, right? I don't believe they're at odds. And that's another topic of conversation. That's another great debate because you find believers who are scientists all the time, right? And so won't get into that whole discussion because, again, that's probably another topic for another podcast. But I think exploring truth and belief and understanding when they're different, if they're different, and being aware of the times when it's appropriate to have our beliefs be challenged by new metrics and things that help us to understand what the truth of any given phenomenon is. and how we come to accept and then take that new discovery into our own belief system, and why that's the case, right? And some people, it can be harder than others. And I think ultimately, when it comes down to persuasion or convincing people about certain arguments, why should we even accept reason to begin with, right? Or if someone has some scientific study that proves something that you might hold to be true or that you believe in, and that's contradictory to what you believe in, why should you accept it? Is it reasonable to assume that they would think that you should just accept it just off the principle? Because, right, like there are plenty of people out there who deny who deny what others would claim to be facts, right? And so I think all of that's kind of wrapped up together, and I think it's important to point that out when we can, and start to explore the ideas so people can start to recognize it within themselves and in others to help people. And then sometimes, you'll just have people out there who just prefer to be who they are. And I think that for me, that's important. It's like, well, if you want to hold this position that seems to be counter to reason, here's why I think that is the case. If you can agree to that, as long as you're saying, okay, well, I get that why what I believe could be seen as reasonable, but don't hold the position like you're reasonable when we can actually draw some conclusions based off of, if we kind of do a walkthrough and it's like, well, here's where you're wrong and it doesn't quite line up. It's just like, just being honest about, our findings and trying to move past our biases from time to time, especially when it's appropriate to do so. And so I think this is going to be a fun one to kind of see, again, where people stand and ultimately get to the point where people can start to explore and discuss what they think, why they think it, why they believe it. If there's a time where you have had to shift your beliefs because of new evidence found, if that's even how you accept new knowledge, right, through evidence, the nature of evidence, etc. So this is what I'd like everyone to do. If you're listening to this, not a homework assignment, but just, you can call it intellectual meditation. I actually do this. Meditation is, I'm just going to call it that. Maybe I can coin that. Maybe I can start something there. But essentially, it's just at times, and you can try this maybe, before you go to sleep or something like that, but just take 5 or 10 minutes. Think about something that you believe in, right? I think the next podcast will do an example, kind of a walkthrough of kind of how, of sort of the thesis of the major core component of what the podcast ultimately is going to be about. It's going to be, okay, think of something that you might hold to be true. It can be any hot topic item. It can be a more basic value that you hold, and just start to think about why you believe that to be, whatever it is, the case, or why you hold that to be the truth, right? And does it reasonably line up with your worldview? And going all the way back to the beginning of the podcast, I believe I mentioned that belief isn't necessarily a term meaning rooted in religion or some kind of belief system that you have to hold in the belief of something supernatural beyond nature or anything like that. It's really just to say, what's your most basic view, your worldview, your most basic view on the foundation on what you think what you accept, we'll say, right? Because to sometimes truth to us can be that which we just simply accept, right? For an example, all these things that we think are perceptions that we hold, but objectivity sort of comes in largely sometimes to collaboration with others, right? Like right now, I'm going to knock on this table. There's a table right in front of me. I accept that this is a table because my experience of tables and my understanding of other people's experience of tables tells me that I can reliably say the table exists, right? Like I'm sitting here. How do I know that this table is not just my imagination, right? How do I know that this table is not just my perceptions through my five senses, right? If somebody else walked in the room and I said, well, I see a table, I feel a table, and then they say, well, look at that. I see and feel a table too. So that tells me, okay, there's something outside of my experience. If I'm willing to grant that that person has equal perceptions and has the same faculties that I have, if I'm willing to grant that, which could be another question. But again, we won't go to this deep level of philosophy where you can sort of question everything. We have to start somewhere, right? And we can start with our basic perceptions. And if we grant that there's another person that can also validate those perceptions by saying, yeah, I see a table too, then I know, well, if I close my eyes or if I leave the room, if you can still see a table there, then there's probably something real about the table. And if you leave and I stand here and I can see a table, then there at least is a good reason to assume that there's probably a table, right? And so those are some of the things that we don't think about in our day-to-day lives, but we do accept it to be true. And so the thinking about thinking is to say, well, let's think about it. Let's just not take it for granted. Let's not trivialize, and let's not, just accept it for the sake of accepting it when you're trying to think through these thoughts. Actually formulate how you get from point A to point B and the reason that you get from point A to point B. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to do this, right? It's just to say, I'm going to use my common sense to really be critical and think through this idea and see if it holds water and see if, there is, like I said, a logical line that can be drawn between the two and ultimately help you to draw conclusions about the reality that we live in. And that's when you start to develop the idea of objectivity, right? And subjectivity is validated in that objectivity when that objectivity seems to be real, right? When it seems to be validated through other means of exploring the world, like a science or something like that. I think it's important to point out that when we use the scientific method as a tool of getting close to truth, first you have to accept some principles about truth, right? And I believe the core principles of truth is coherency, right? And consistency. And science parallels that in some degree. The two major pillars of science is something we have to be able to observe it to some degree, and we have to be able to repeat it to some degree, right? Obviously, there are certain disciplines where you can't necessarily do that, which I think that's where you start to reach the limits of science. And I might have said that in the podcast before, or maybe even earlier, but in this podcast. But it's important to know that that is how we should perceive science as a tool, because then it starts to help us understand where the limits of that tool is. And then when you start to explore other disciplines, it can help you, in different ways. Science is not the only way to truth. I'm not that's scientism, right? Believing that science is the only way to truth. And I think I don't hold that view. I know some people who may stick closer to that, who may not necessarily believe it, but might think that, well, science is the only reliable tool that we have. I don't hold that worldview. Obviously, I'm a believer, and in addition to that, there's plenty of other fields of study that don't necessarily that are true, that we believe in, that we don't necessarily have to do it sort of through the same scientific investigation using those two pillars, observation and repeatability. So again, I think take any position that you hold, give it some thought, really take and analyze why you believe that thing by going back to what your worldview is, understanding your belief system, why you accept certain things to be the way that they are, that ultimately help to build those values that you hold, which ultimately gets you the conclusion that you hold on that particular thing, and kind of just explore it a bit. And I think that will start to get your brain flowing and start to help you to understand what we're trying to accomplish in this podcast, and start to help you be able to develop and do that a little bit quicker on a daily basis. Because I believe it's just like any muscle. The more you flex it, the more you work it out, the better you'll become at it. And I know that, this kind of way of thinking can be exhaustive sometimes. So again, just kind of get into, kind of challenging everybody who's listening to this, because I do this all the time. I just sit and I think about things, and it helps me to be able to process and learn how to do it quickly. And I think it is just a great tool to have in your tool belt. The critical thinking tool, and to sharpen that knife is always a good thing. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. Hopefully, if that was great, if you're confused, if that didn't make sense at all, please leave a comment. Let me know. I love to hear feedback. I love to get people's opinions. If it was, if it made sense, if it didn't make sense, please let me know. I'm always here for the feedback. And again, like I said, as we move forward, I try to make this a little bit shorter. By a little bit shorter, it's like 6 minutes, but I think as we move forward, we'll continue to refine and get a little bit better, and it'll be a little bit more clear at times. But right now we're dealing with some really, really big ideas, and I kind of just want to throw the ideas out there in a live sort of session, think through them with you. There may be some podcasts where we're just like, I haven't thought about that. Let's think about it right now. And that can be a good example of kind of how I think through things. And I think it's a decent method to use when considering anything that you hold to be true. Thinking about why you believe it, and if the belief itself is reconcilable through reason and other methods. And so we're going to continue to explore that. Next time, like I said, maybe I'll give an example. Maybe I'll define a couple more terms. Maybe we'll go through what, the three basic forms of reasoning: abductive, inductive, and inductive, deductive, and abductive reasoning. We can go through the nature of evidence, when it applies, when do our belief systems and our biases contradict other things that you would otherwise accept to be true. So there's just a whole world to explore here. But again, just wanted to throw out some ideas to get everybody, thinking about this at a deeper level, because that's what I want. I want to start challenging everybody, again, including myself, to think a little deeper, because everything that we hold, again, comes from a particular place that's intrinsic in us all, and it's worthy of exploration. And so, again, thank you guys again for tuning in. I appreciate you all. Hope you have a blessed night. We will return as regularly as I can. And thank you guys for tuning in. I appreciate you. We'll talk to you and catch you next time.